My husband gave me a vacuum cleaner for our anniversary. I gave him divorce papers wrapped in the warranty. For our first anniversary, Brett got me a vacuum cleaner. He said it was top of the line and would make cleaning so much easier for me. For my birthday, he bought me a steam mop. Christmas brought a new washing machine because the old one took too long and his shirts weren't getting clean enough. Valentine's Day was a set of organizing bins for the pantry so I could find ingredients faster when cooking his meals. Every special occasion, every celebration, another household item wrapped in a bow. His gifts to himself, meanwhile, were different. A new gaming computer, season tickets to see his team, that motorcycle he'd always wanted, expensive whiskey collections. But for me, always something to make my housework more efficient. His mother thought it was wonderful. "Brett's so practical," she'd say. "He knows what you really need." His friends agreed. "You're lucky he pays attention to what would help around the house." Even my own sister said I was being ungrateful when I complained. At least he remembers occasions. So when our 5th anniversary approached, I knew exactly what was coming. I'd heard him on the phone with his brother. "Yeah, I'm getting Emma one of those robot vacuums. She'll love not having to vacuum anymore. Except I'd still be the one emptying it, cleaning the brushes, troubleshooting when it got stuck. Just like I maintained all his previous gifts. But this year, I was ready. 3 weeks before our anniversary, I started my plan. I opened a separate bank account and moved half our savings into it. I hired movers for a specific date. I found an apartment across town, and I started documenting everything. Not for court or social media, but for one very specific purpose. The morning of our anniversary, Brett was practically bouncing with excitement. We were having dinner at his parents' house to celebrate. The whole family would be there. "I got you something amazing this year," he kept saying. "Something that'll change your life." That afternoon, while Brett was at work, I executed everything. The movers came and took exactly half of everything. Half the furniture, half the kitchen items, half the electronics. But here's the thing. I only took my half. Every single household gift he'd ever given me stayed behind. The vacuum, the mop, the washing machine, the organizing bins, the slow cooker, the air fryer, the carpet cleaner. All of it, right where it belonged. In his house. I also left him a gift. 5 presents, actually, wrapped beautifully and placed on the dining room table. Each one labeled with a year of our marriage. Then I went to his parents' house early. His mother let me in, chattering about how excited she was to see what practical gift Brett had chosen this year. The whole family was gathering. His brother Kevin, his sister Amy, his parents, his aunt and uncle, his 3 cousins, even his best friend Rick was there. Brett arrived at 6, carrying a large box wrapped in silver paper. The robot vacuum, right on schedule. "Where's Emma?" he asked, looking around. "I'm right here," I said, walking in from the kitchen. "But before you give me your gift, I have something for you. It's at the house. I left you 5 presents on the dining room table." Brett looked confused but intrigued. 5 presents? "One for each year of our marriage," I explained. "I thought it was time I gave you something as practical as what you've been giving me." His mother clapped. "How thoughtful." "Brett, you should open them now. We can wait for dinner." Brett called his brother to drive him home since he'd been drinking. 20 minutes later, my phone started exploding with texts. But I didn't need to read them. I knew what he'd found. The first box contained divorce papers. The second box held a list of every household gift he'd given me, with the hours I'd spent using and maintaining them calculated out. 2,847 hours over 5 years. The third box had printed screenshots of his purchases for himself during our marriage. $73,000 on hobbies and toys. The fourth box contained a single key, the key to the apartment he no longer knew I'd rented. The fifth and largest box held a note. "Happy anniversary, Brett. I've left you all the gifts you gave me over the years. Now you can discover how much easier they make your life. The vacuum is in the closet. The mop is in the laundry room. The washing machine is all yours. The organizing bins are ready for you to fill. Every practical thing you thought I needed is now exactly where it belongs. With you. Enjoy maintaining them yourself." His family was staring at me in stunned silence when Brett burst back through the door, Kevin trailing behind him. His face was bright red and he was breathing like he'd run up a flight of stairs. His phone was gripped, so tight in his hand that his knuckles looked white. Kevin stood behind him looking like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. The whole family just stared at me, then at Brett, then back at me again. Nobody seemed to know what to say. Brett's mother finally broke the silence and asked what on earth was going on. Brett lost it. He started yelling about how I'd moved out while he was at work, about how I'd left him divorce papers wrapped up like a present, about how I'd taken half of everything and abandoned him on our anniversary. The room exploded with noise. His aunt gasped. His cousins started talking all at once. His mother put her hand over her mouth. I stayed right where I was on the couch. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears, but somehow I felt really calm on the outside. Brett kept waving his phone around, probably showing them pictures of the empty house and the boxes I'd left on the table. His mother turned to look at me with this expression like I'd just kicked a puppy. She asked me how I could do something so cruel to her son. I told her I'd left Brett exactly what he'd been giving me for 5 years, practical items he needs to maintain his household. She jumped right in to defend him. She said Brett had always been so thoughtful and generous with his gifts, that he really cared about making my life easier. But while she was talking, I noticed Amy watching me from across the room. She had this weird look on her face, not angry or shocked like everyone else, more like she was thinking really hard about something. Brett started demanding answers. He wanted to know how I could humiliate him like this in front of his entire family. I pointed out that he was the one who insisted we have our anniversary dinner here with everyone present. I would have been perfectly happy to handle this privately. But he made it public by bringing me here, so he could show off his latest practical gift in front of everyone. That seemed to make him even more mad. Rick stood up quietly and headed for the door. He mumbled something about needing to go and practically ran out of the house. Brett's father cleared his throat and suggested that maybe everyone should calm down. He said we should discuss this like rational adults. But Brett was too worked up to listen. He kept asking me over and over how long I'd been planning this betrayal. When did I decide to stab him in the back? How could I be so sneaky and dishonest? I pulled out my phone and told everyone I had a spreadsheet. It showed every single gift Brett had given me over 5 years. Right next to it was every gift he'd bought for himself during the same time. I offered to show it to anyone who wanted to see. Amy suddenly said she'd like to see it. Her mother shot her this really sharp look, but Amy just ignored it and kept looking at me. Brett's mother jumped back in. She said that providing for a household is what marriage is all about. That I should be grateful Brett thought about making my responsibilities easier. That a good wife appreciates practical help. I looked right at her and said that a husband should be a partner, not a boss who assigns his employee more efficient tools to do her job as his unpaid housekeeper. The room got really quiet after that. Kevin tried to step in and mediate. He said maybe everyone should take a break. Talk about this tomorrow when people weren't so emotional. But Brett spun around and got right in his brother's face. He asked Kevin whose side he was on. Was he really going to let me get away with this? Kevin looked miserable. He mumbled something about not taking sides and stared down at the floor. Amy stood up. She announced that she wanted to hear more about the 2,847 hours I'd calculated. She said that number seemed really significant and she was curious about it. Her husband reached over and tried to shush her. He told her this wasn't the time. But Amy shook him off and told him she wanted to know. She sat back down and crossed her arms, waiting for me to explain. So I walked them through my methodology. I told them I'd tracked every single hour I spent vacuuming, mopping, doing laundry, organizing the pantry, and cooking meals over the past 5 years. I used the gifts Brett gave me as markers. Like when he gave me the vacuum, that's when vacuuming became my job instead of something we shared. When he gave me the organizing bins, that's when managing the pantry became my responsibility. I added up all those hours across 5 years. The room got very quiet as I explained. 2,847 hours of household labor. That equals about 71 full work weeks, almost a year and a half of full-time work that I did for free while Brett spent $73,000 on motorcycles and gaming computers and season tickets for himself. Brett's father cleared his throat and raised one hand like he was trying to calm everyone down. He said maybe both sides had good points here, and perhaps Brett and I should talk about this privately without the whole family watching. Before I could respond, Brett's mother cut in and said absolutely not. She pointed at me and said I was being dramatic and unreasonable about the whole thing. Her generation didn't complain about household duties, she said. They just did what needed to be done without making a scene. I stayed seated on the couch and kept my voice level when I told her that her generation also didn't have husbands spending $73,000 on motorcycles and gaming equipment while giving their wives mops for Valentine's Day. Amy made this sound that was half laugh, half cough, and when her mother whipped around to glare at her, Amy covered her mouth with her hand and stared at the floor. Kevin shifted his weight from one foot to the other and looked like he wanted to disappear into the carpet. Brett's father opened his mouth like he might say something else, but then closed it again and just shook his head. Brett finally spoke up from where he stood near the doorway. He asked me what I actually wanted from all this. His voice sounded tired instead of angry now, and he spread his hands out like he genuinely didn't understand. I looked right at him and said I wanted a divorce. I wanted my fair share of our assets. And I wanted him to understand that I'm a person, not household staff, but I wasn't holding my breath on that last part. The room went completely silent for about 3 seconds. Then his mother exploded. She called me selfish and said I was throwing away a good marriage over material things. She said Brett worked hard to provide for me and this was how I repaid him. I turned to look at her and kept my voice steady when I corrected her. I told her I was leaving because Brett had spent 5 years showing me exactly how little he valued me as a person, and I finally started believing him. When someone shows you who they are, you should listen. Brett's mother opened her mouth to respond, but Amy suddenly stood up. She said she needed to talk to me privately in the kitchen right now. Her mother immediately protested and said this wasn't the time for private conversations. But Amy was already walking toward the kitchen, and she looked back at me with this urgent expression on her face. I got up and followed her, leaving Brett and his family in the living room behind us. I could hear Brett's mother saying something sharp, but Amy had already pushed through the kitchen door. Once we were alone in the kitchen, Amy leaned back against the counter and wrapped her arms around herself. She looked at me and said quietly that she got a bread maker for her last anniversary. For her birthday, her husband gave her a new ironing board, because the old one was getting wobbly. She'd been telling herself it was fine because her husband was practical too, just like Brett. She said this while staring at the floor, and her voice got smaller with each word. I could see her eyes getting shiny like she might cry, and I realized what I'd done by confronting Brett tonight. I'd cracked something open for Amy that she wasn't ready to face yet. I pulled out my phone and opened a new contact entry. I gave Amy my new phone number and told her she could call me anytime if she wanted to talk. I didn't push or ask questions because I could see she was overwhelmed and trying not to fall apart right there in her mother's kitchen. She nodded and saved the number in her phone with shaking hands. We stood there for another minute not saying anything, and then Amy took a deep breath and said we should probably go back out there. When we returned to the living room, Brett was sitting on the couch with his head in his hands. His mother sat next to him with one hand on his shoulder, and she looked up at me with pure hatred in her eyes. Kevin and his father were talking quietly by the window. The aunt and uncle and cousins had moved to the far side of the room and were pretending to look at family photos on the wall. I walked to the center of the room and announced that I was leaving now. I said Brett could contact me through my attorney for anything related to the divorce. Brett's mother immediately demanded to know who my attorney was. She said it like she was going to call them up and tell them what a terrible person I was, like that would somehow change the legal proceedings. I just smiled at her and headed for the door. I grabbed my purse from the front hall table and pulled my car keys out. Brett jumped up from the couch and followed me outside onto the front porch. He asked if we could please just talk about this like adults without getting lawyers involved. His voice had that pleading tone now, the one he used when he really wanted something. I turned to face him under the porch light and reminded him that I tried talking to him for 5 years. I tried telling him I wanted actual gifts, not household appliances. I tried explaining that I felt like his housekeeper instead of his wife. And he responded to all of that by buying me a steam mop. So I was done talking and ready to move forward legally. Brett started to say something else, but I was already walking down the driveway to my car. I got in, started the engine, and drove away without looking back at the house. Over the next few days, my phone exploded with texts from Brett. The first ones were angry, calling me crazy and saying I'd regret this. Then they turned pleading, asking why I was doing this and couldn't we work it out. Then confused, like he genuinely didn't understand what he'd done wrong. Some of them were long paragraphs about how much he loved me and how he'd change. Others were short and desperate, just asking me to respond. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I forwarded every single message to Amelia Vaughn, the attorney I'd hired 2 weeks ago when I started planning my exit. She'd been thorough and professional during our initial consultation, and she'd helped me understand exactly what I was entitled to in the divorce. Now she had documentation of Brett trying to contact me directly, despite me telling him to go through my lawyer. The next morning, Amelia called while I was unpacking boxes in my new apartment. She got straight to business and told me Brett had been trying to reach me through multiple phone numbers and even sent emails to my old work address. She asked if I wanted her to send a formal cease and desist letter to make him stop. I thought about it for a minute while I folded a kitchen towel and put it in a drawer. I told her not yet because I wanted to see if he would calm down on his own without making everything more complicated. She said that was fine, but she was keeping records of every attempt he made to contact me. I thanked her for staying on top of everything, and we hung up. 2 days later was my first day at the new marketing job I had lined up before I left Brett. I walked into the office building feeling nervous but also excited in a way I had not felt in years. The company was smaller than where I used to work, and everyone seemed friendly right away. My boss showed me to my desk and introduced me to the team. That is when I met Victoria from the design department. She had bright red hair and wore these chunky silver rings on almost every finger. During the morning meeting, she made a joke about the coffee being terrible, and I actually laughed out loud. After the meeting ended, Victoria came over to my desk and asked if I wanted to grab lunch with her. I hesitated because I was not sure I was ready to make friends or explain my situation to anyone. But she had this warm smile and she said the sandwich place down the street was way better than the cafeteria. So I agreed. We walked to the sandwich shop and ordered at the counter. Victoria got turkey and I got chicken salad. We sat by the window and she asked me the normal questions about where I was from and how long I had been in town. Then she asked if I had just moved because she noticed my address on the employee paperwork was really recent. I do not know why, but I just started talking. Maybe it was because she was a stranger and it felt safe. Maybe it was because I had been holding everything in for so long. I told her the whole story while we ate our sandwiches. The vacuum cleaner for our first anniversary. The steam mop for my birthday. The 5 years of household gifts while Brett bought himself motorcycles and gaming computers. The divorce papers wrapped in boxes on our anniversary. Victoria listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she wiped her mouth with a napkin and said her ex-husband gave her a gym membership for Christmas one year. She said he told her it would help her get back in shape after having their baby. She said she filed for divorce 4 months later. We sat there for a minute not saying anything, and then we both started laughing. Not funny laughing, but the kind of laughing you do when you realize you are not alone in something awful. When we got back to the office, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. That evening, Amelia sent me an email with a long list of assets we needed to document for the divorce proceedings. I opened the attachment and stared at all the categories: retirement accounts, stock options, investment portfolios, property values. I realized I had no idea what Brett actually made or what accounts he might have. For 5 years, I managed the household and paid the bills from our joint checking account while Brett handled everything else. He said he was better with money, and I trusted him. Now I was seeing how that left me with no information and no control. I spent the next 3 hours going through old bank statements and credit card bills that I could still access online. The joint account showed normal stuff like groceries and utilities, but then I found another credit card that was only in Brett's name. I clicked through the statements and my stomach dropped. Charges for expensive dinners at restaurants I had never been to. Bar tabs for hundreds of dollars. Hotel rooms. A weekend trip to Vegas that he told me was a work conference. The spending went back years and added up to way more than the $73,000 I had already documented. I took screenshots of everything and sent them to Amelia with a short message asking if this was normal. She called me 20 minutes later instead of emailing back. Her voice was different, more serious than usual. She asked if I had ever agreed to Brett spending marital funds this way. I told her I did not even know about most of it. She was quiet for a few seconds, and then she said this was good for our case. She said it showed Brett was hiding assets and spending shared money without my knowledge or consent. She told me to keep looking through any accounts I could access and document everything. When we hung up, I sat on my couch feeling stupid and angry at the same time. How had I not known about any of this? The next afternoon, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. I almost did not answer, but something made me pick up. It was Brett's mother. I was surprised because I did not think she had my new number. Before I could even say hello, she launched into this whole speech about how I was destroying her son and tearing apart the family. She said I should be ashamed of myself for the embarrassment I caused at the anniversary dinner. She asked if I even cared about what people were saying or how Brett was suffering. I let her talk without interrupting. She went on for probably 5 minutes, her voice getting higher and more upset. When she finally stopped to take a breath, I said very calmly that Brett destroyed our marriage by treating me like an appliance instead of a wife. I said if the family was embarrassed, they should ask themselves why they encouraged his behavior for 5 years. She made this sputtering sound like she could not believe I had just said that. Then she hung up on me. I immediately went into my phone settings and blocked her number. At work the next week, I discovered something surprising. I was actually good at marketing strategy when I was not completely exhausted from maintaining an entire household by myself. My boss asked me to look at a campaign proposal and give my thoughts. I spent an hour reviewing it and wrote up a detailed analysis with suggestions for improvement. When I sent it to him, he came to my desk 15 minutes later and said my ideas were exactly what the campaign needed. He said he was impressed with my strategic thinking. I felt this little spark of pride that I had not felt in years. That Friday, Victoria stopped by my desk and asked if I wanted to come to her book club that night. I almost said no automatically. For 5 years, I always rushed home after work to make dinner and do laundry and keep the house running. But then I realized I had no reason to rush home anymore. My apartment was small and clean, and there was no one waiting for me to cook their meal. So I told Victoria yes. That evening, I sat in a living room with 5 women I did not know. We drank wine from actual wine glasses, not the cheap ones Brett always bought. We talked about a novel I had actually had time to read over the past week. One woman made a joke about the main character and everyone laughed. Another woman asked what I thought about the ending, and people actually listened when I answered. I looked around at these women drinking wine and discussing a book on a Friday night, and I realized this was what I had been missing. Not the book club specifically, but the feeling of having my own life, of spending time on things that had nothing to do with household management or making someone else comfortable. When I left that night and drove back to my apartment, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. I felt like myself. The woman sitting next to me on the couch set down her wine glass and said she got divorced 3 years ago. Another woman across the room looked up from the book and said she'd been divorced for 5 years. A third woman laughed and said she was currently separated and the papers would be final next month. The fourth woman, the one who'd made the joke earlier, said her divorce was 6 years behind her and she'd never been happier. I sat there holding my wine glass and realized I wasn't alone in this. These women had all reached a point where they decided they deserved better treatment, and they'd actually done something about it. They were sitting here drinking wine and talking about books and living their lives. The conversation shifted to divorce stories, and I mostly listened. One woman talked about her ex-husband who expected dinner on the table every night at 6, but never once cooked a meal himself. Another described how her ex would buy himself new golf clubs while complaining they couldn't afford her gym membership. They weren't bitter or angry anymore. They were just matter-of-fact about what had happened and why they'd left. When I got home that night, I felt lighter somehow, like I'd found proof that leaving was the right choice. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was making dinner in my apartment. It was my landlord. He asked if I knew a Brett Morrison who was downstairs in the lobby demanding to see me. My stomach dropped, but I kept my voice calm and told him yes, that was my soon-to-be ex-husband. The landlord asked if I wanted Brett removed from the building. I said yes, that I had a lawyer handling all communication, and Brett was not welcome at my apartment. The landlord said he'd take care of it and hung up. I stood in my kitchen with my phone in my hand and felt my heart racing. Brett had found out where I lived. He'd actually driven over here and tried to get up to my apartment. I called Amelia and left a message about what had just happened. She called back 10 minutes later and said she'd add this to the file and that it was time to have Brett officially served with divorce papers. The next afternoon, Amelia texted me that the process server had delivered the papers to Brett at his office. She said to expect him to contact me and to not respond no matter what he said. I was at my desk at work when my phone started ringing from a number I didn't know. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Brett's voice came through immediately, loud and angry. He said I'd embarrassed him in front of his entire department by having him served at work. He said people were asking questions and he looked like an idiot. I hung up without saying a word and blocked the number right away. My hands were shaking, but I felt strangely calm. He was upset about being embarrassed at work while I'd spent 5 years being treated like hired help. I went back to reviewing the marketing campaign on my computer screen. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Kevin. He asked if I was okay and said he was sorry about everything. I stared at the message for a while before responding. I told him I was fine and thanked him for checking in. He texted back saying Brett had always been selfish, but Kevin never thought it was his place to say anything. He said he wished he'd spoken up sooner. I told him I appreciated that, but it wasn't his responsibility to fix his brother's marriage. Kevin said he understood and that he hoped I was doing well. The conversation felt awkward but genuine. At least one person in Brett's family seemed to get it. 2 days later, I sat in Clarence Vaughn's office while he pulled up spreadsheets on his computer. Amelia had set up the meeting and explained that her husband was a financial advisor who helped clients understand their assets during divorce proceedings. Clarence was patient and kind as he walked me through bank statements and investment accounts. He explained things I should have understood years ago about retirement funds and tax implications. I felt embarrassed that I'd let Brett handle all the finances while I focused on keeping the house running. Clarence said it was common and that I shouldn't feel bad about it. He said the important thing was understanding everything now, so I could protect my interests going forward. I took notes and asked questions and felt grateful that Amelia had connected me with someone who actually wanted to help. Clarence went quiet while looking at something on his screen. He asked if I knew Brett had a retirement account through his company. I said I thought we just had the joint savings account. Clarence turned his monitor toward me and showed me statements for an account I'd never seen before. Brett had been putting money into this retirement fund for the entire 5 years of our marriage. Clarence clicked to another screen and showed me stock options from Brett's company that had significant value. He said I was entitled to half of everything that had been accumulated during our marriage. The numbers on the screen were way higher than I'd expected. I'd thought I might walk away with a few $1,000s and my personal stuff. Clarence was showing me that I was owed tens of thousands. The next week, Amelia called me at work. She said Brett's attorney had sent over a settlement offer. I could hear something in her voice that sounded like amusement. She read me the offer. Brett was willing to let me keep my personal belongings and my car. He'd give me $5,000. That was it. Amelia actually laughed when she finished reading. She said we'd be sending back a counteroffer based on the actual marital assets Clarence had documented. She said Brett's attorney was either incompetent or hoping I was too naive to know better. I told her to send whatever she thought was fair. Amelia said she'd have something drafted by end of week and that I shouldn't worry because we had documentation of everything. Saturday night came and I sat alone in my apartment with takeout food and a movie on my laptop. The apartment was quiet. Nobody was going to come home expecting dinner. Nobody was going to leave dirty dishes in the sink for me to clean. Nobody was going to ask me to pause my movie so I could find something for them. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt this weird doubt creeping in. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe Brett was just clueless about how to be a good husband. Maybe if I'd explained things differently, he would have understood. Then I remembered the spreadsheet I'd made. The $73,000 Brett spent on himself while giving me cleaning supplies for every special occasion. The 2,847 hours I'd spent maintaining all his practical gifts. The way he'd looked genuinely confused when I left him divorce papers. He wasn't clueless. He just didn't think my time or feelings mattered as much as his comfort and hobbies. I finished my takeout and went back to watching my movie. My phone rang on Tuesday evening. Amy's name showed up on the screen. I answered and heard her voice shaking. She said she'd confronted her husband about their anniversary gift pattern. She'd asked him why she always got household items while he bought himself whatever he wanted. He'd gotten mad and said she was influenced by my feminist nonsense. Amy said they'd had a huge fight and now they were going to marriage counseling. She said she didn't know if her marriage was going to survive. I felt terrible. I told her I was sorry for causing problems in her relationship. Amy cut me off and said I hadn't caused anything. She said the counselor had already helped her see problems that had been there all along. Her husband expected her to do all the cooking and cleaning and childcare while also working full-time. He bought himself new tools and electronics but complained when she wanted to spend money on herself. The counselor said those were signs of an unequal partnership. Amy's voice got stronger as she talked. She said counseling was painful but necessary. She thanked me for helping her see that she deserved to be valued as a person and not just as a wife and mother. I told her I was proud of her for standing up for herself. Amy said it was scary, but she felt more like herself than she had in years. After we hung up, I sat on my couch and thought about how one vacuum cleaner had set off a chain reaction that was changing multiple lives. Monday morning, I walked into the office and found my boss waiting by my desk. She said she wanted to talk to me about a new project and led me to the conference room. A major client was looking for a marketing team to handle their product launch, and my boss wanted me to lead the pitch. I stared at her for a second because I'd only been at this job for 2 months. She smiled and said I'd shown more drive and fresh ideas in those 2 months than some people showed in years. She said she trusted me to handle it and the pitch was scheduled for Friday. I spent the week preparing and realized something strange was happening. I had energy I didn't remember having before. Ideas came easily, and I stayed late working on the presentation without feeling tired or angry about it. At home with Brett, I'd always been exhausted from maintaining the house and managing his needs and dealing with his complaints. Now I was working harder than ever, but I felt awake and excited instead of drained. Friday came and I walked into the pitch meeting with Victoria handling the design elements while I presented the strategy. The client asked tough questions, and I answered everyone without hesitation. They said they'd let us know their decision by the end of day. 3 hours later, my boss called me into her office and said we got the account. Victoria grabbed my arm in the hallway and insisted we had to celebrate. We went to a restaurant downtown and ordered appetizers and drinks, and I found myself laughing at her stories about previous client disasters. She asked about my divorce, and I realized I was talking about my work achievements instead of household management for the first time in months. The whole evening felt light and easy, and I drove home thinking about the next phase of the campaign, instead of wondering what mess would be waiting for me. Tuesday morning, Amelia forwarded me an email from Brett's attorney. Brett wanted to try marriage counseling before finalizing the divorce. The email said Brett recognized there were problems, and he was willing to work on them if I'd give him another chance. Amelia's note at the top asked what I wanted to do. I wrote back that counseling would have been great 5 years ago when I first started complaining about the vacuum cleaner and the steam mop. Now I was done talking and ready to move forward with the divorce. Amelia responded within minutes saying she'd send that message to Brett's attorney in more professional language. Thursday afternoon, I was in a meeting reviewing campaign materials when the receptionist called my extension. She said there were people in the lobby demanding to speak with me about a personal emergency. I excused myself and walked out to find Brett's entire family standing there. His mother was in front with Brett's father beside her, and Kevin and Amy hovering behind them looking uncomfortable. Brett's mother started talking loudly about how I needed to stop this divorce nonsense and come home where I belonged. Other people in the lobby were staring, and I felt my face get hot. I said this wasn't the place for this conversation and they needed to leave. She said she wasn't leaving until I agreed to talk sense. I walked to the reception desk and asked the receptionist to call building security. 2 security guards arrived within minutes, and I explained that these people were harassing me about a personal matter. The guards asked Brett's family to leave, and his mother started arguing that they had a right to see me. One guard said they were on private property and needed to exit immediately, or police would be called. Kevin took his mother's arm and pulled her toward the door while the rest of the family followed. Amy looked back at me with an expression I couldn't read before she left. I went straight to my boss's office and apologized for the disruption. She closed the door and asked if I was safe and if I needed help. I explained the divorce situation and the family harassment, and she said the company would support me completely. She said if they showed up again, security had instructions to call police immediately. She also said she'd been through a difficult divorce herself, and she understood how hard it was. I thanked her and went back to work, but my hands were shaking. That evening, I called Amelia and told her what happened. She was quiet for a moment and then said we needed to file for a restraining order. She said the workplace confrontation combined with all the previous contact attempts and Brett's mother's blocked calls created a pattern of harassment. She said she'd have the paperwork ready by tomorrow and we'd go to the courthouse. Friday afternoon, we sat in front of a judge while Amelia presented a folder of documentation. Every text from Brett, every call from his mother, every attempt to contact me at home and work, all of it printed out and organized by date. The judge read through it and asked if Brett's family had been informed that I wanted no contact. Amelia said yes and showed the judge copies of her letters to Brett's attorney stating I would only communicate through legal counsel. The judge granted a temporary restraining order requiring Brett and his entire family to stay at least 500 feet from my home and workplace. Brett's attorney called Amelia later that day, and she said he was furious. She told me he'd accused us of trying to manipulate the court, and she'd calmly explained that we were protecting me from harassment that his client's family was committing. The following week, I found a letter in my mailbox at the apartment. It was from Brett's aunt, the one who'd been at the anniversary dinner. She said she'd been thinking about what I said that night about being treated like household staff instead of a partner. She said she was sorry for not speaking up because she'd always thought Brett's gift choices were thoughtless, but she'd convinced herself it wasn't her business. She said watching me walk away that night had made her think about her own marriage and the things she'd been accepting for years. She wasn't excusing Brett's behavior, but she wanted me to know that at least one person in his family understood why I left. I read the letter twice and then put it in a drawer. It was kind of her to reach out, but it didn't change anything about my decision. 3 weeks later, I sat in a conference room at Amelia's office for the divorce mediation session. Brett and his attorney were on one side of the table, and Amelia and I were on the other. Brett looked terrible. He'd lost weight and had dark circles under his eyes, and his shirt looked wrinkled like he'd slept in it. Part of me felt bad seeing him like that until he opened his mouth. The mediator introduced herself and explained the process and asked if everyone was ready to begin. Brett's attorney said they were ready, and Amelia said we were too. The mediator turned to Brett and asked him to start by explaining his perspective on the marriage and what he thought was fair. Brett leaned forward and asked if I was really going to destroy him financially over some household gifts. His voice was angry and bitter, and I felt Amelia tense beside me. I said calmly that I wasn't destroying anyone. I was claiming my legal share of marital assets, and if he felt destroyed, it was because he'd spent 5 years taking me for granted while spending our money on himself. His attorney put a hand on Brett's arm and whispered something, but Brett ignored him. The mediator asked Brett to explain what he meant about household gifts, and he said he'd been trying to be a good husband by helping me be more efficient with household tasks. He said he'd spent good money on quality appliances that made my life easier, and he didn't understand why I was so angry about it. Amelia kicked me under the table because I'd started to smile at the absurdity of what I was hearing. Brett genuinely seemed to believe that buying me cleaning supplies while he bought himself motorcycles and gaming equipment was him being helpful. The mediator asked if he understood that his wife might have wanted different kinds of gifts for special occasions, and Brett said he'd been practical and focused on what we actually needed. I couldn't stay quiet anymore, and said what we'd actually needed was a partner who valued me as a person, instead of as unpaid household staff. Brett's attorney jumped in and suggested we take a short break, but the mediator said we should continue. She turned to Brett and asked what he thought a fair settlement would be. Brett said I should take my personal items and my car, and we'd call it even since he'd paid most of the bills during our marriage. Amelia opened her folder and calmly pulled out documentation, showing I'd contributed equally to household income for the first 3 years of our marriage. She showed bank statements and pay stubs and tax returns all organized by year. Then she showed the mediator the email from Brett asking me to go part-time so I could handle more of the housework and cooking. She showed my reduced paychecks after that, and calculated the income I'd given up at Brett's request. The mediator studied the documents and asked Brett's attorney if he'd seen this information before. He admitted he hadn't, and looked at Brett with an expression that suggested they'd be having words later. Amelia started pulling out more documents, showing the mediator the breakdown of household contributions and financial disparities, but Brett kept shaking his head and insisting he'd been responsible with money and thoughtful about gifts. The mediator asked him directly if he could see how spending thousands on himself while giving his wife cleaning supplies might seem unequal, and Brett said he'd bought things he needed and things I needed, and he didn't understand why that was a problem. His attorney looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Amelia leaned forward and asked Brett if he'd ever asked me what I wanted for our anniversary or birthday, and Brett said he'd paid attention to what would be useful. The mediator let out a long breath and said she thought we should take a break and reconvene in 2 weeks, and that both parties should think seriously about what constitutes a fair settlement under divorce law. Brett's attorney agreed immediately and started packing up his papers. Brett sat there looking confused and angry, like he couldn't understand why everyone wasn't seeing things his way. We filed out of the conference room and Amelia walked me to the elevator. Once we were alone, she said Brett's stubbornness was actually helping our case because he was making it clear he didn't respect my contributions to the marriage. She said she was confident we'd get a good settlement if we had to go to court, though she'd prefer to settle and save time and money. I asked if she thought Brett would ever understand what he did wrong, and she said some people never do. But that wasn't our problem anymore. The elevator doors opened and I stepped inside, feeling drained but also oddly relieved that the mediation had gone so badly for Brett. 2 days later, I was having coffee with Victoria at our usual place downtown, telling her about the mediation disaster. She was laughing at Brett's insistence that he'd been practical when Rick walked in and spotted us. He hesitated by the door and I saw him considering whether to leave, but then he walked over and asked if he could join us for a minute. I was wary, but Victoria looked interested, so I said okay. Rick sat down and immediately started apologizing for not speaking up sooner about how Brett treated me. He said he'd watched it happen for years, and felt terrible that he never said anything. Victoria excused herself to take a phone call, probably sensing Rick wanted to talk privately. Rick admitted he'd always thought Brett's gift choices were jokes at first, like Brett was being funny by getting me a vacuum. Then he realized Brett was completely serious and didn't know how to say anything without destroying their friendship. He said Brett is a mess now, barely functioning at work, calling Rick at all hours asking what he did wrong. Rick looked genuinely upset and said he hoped I knew I did the right thing even though it was hard. I told him I appreciated him saying that, and I understood why he hadn't spoken up before. Rick said Brett had always been kind of oblivious about other people's feelings, even back in college, but Rick thought marriage would change him. He finished his coffee and left, and Victoria came back asking what that was about. I explained, and she said it was big of Rick to apologize, and maybe some of Brett's friends were finally seeing him clearly. The second mediation session 2 weeks later felt completely different from the first. Brett's attorney must have had a serious talk with him because Brett walked in looking sullen but resigned. His attorney started by saying they were ready to negotiate seriously and work through asset division with actual numbers. Brett didn't say much, just nodded when his attorney asked him questions and looked at the table most of the time. The mediator seemed relieved and pulled out the asset list Amelia had prepared. We went through everything methodically: the house, the cars, the bank accounts, the retirement funds, the stock options. Brett's attorney tried to argue that the stock options shouldn't count as marital assets, since they were from Brett's job, but Amelia calmly explained that anything earned during the marriage was marital property. The mediator agreed and we kept going. It took 3 hours, but we finally reached a settlement where I got half of all marital assets, including the retirement account and stock options. Plus, Brett had to refinance the house to buy out my equity share. It was fair and reasonable, exactly what the law said I was entitled to. I felt relieved even though Brett looked like he was swallowing glass every time he agreed to something. His attorney kept shooting him warning looks whenever Brett seemed like he might object. When we finished, the mediator said she'd draft the settlement agreement and we could sign it next week. Amelia shook hands with Brett's attorney and we left. The following week, we met to sign the settlement agreement. Brett's attorney had him sign first, and then it was my turn. My hand shook a little as I wrote my name, but I felt good about it. This was fair, this was right. Brett asked if he could speak to me privately for a minute after we finished, and Amelia immediately said that wasn't a good idea. But I said 5 minutes was fine. We stepped into an empty office down the hall and Brett closed the door. He said he genuinely didn't understand what he'd been doing wrong and he was sorry. But the way he said it sounded more like he was sorry about losing half his assets than sorry about how he'd treated me. I stood there waiting to see if he'd say anything else, anything that showed real understanding, but he just kept talking about how he'd thought he was being a good husband by being practical. I told him I hoped he learned something from this for his next relationship, and I meant it. He deserved a chance to grow even if it was too late for us. Brett asked if there was any chance we could try again someday, maybe after some time apart, and I told him no. That ship had sailed, but I did wish him well in figuring out how to be a better partner. He looked sad but nodded and opened the door. Amelia was waiting in the hallway and we left together. 6 months after I left those wrapped boxes on our dining room table, I stood in a courtroom watching a judge sign the final divorce papers. The whole process had taken half a year of paperwork and waiting and legal procedures, but now it was done. I felt a weight lift that I didn't fully realize I'd been carrying. The judge handed the papers to the clerk and said we were officially divorced. Brett wasn't even there. His attorney had handled everything. I walked out of the courthouse with Amelia, and she congratulated me on starting my new life. I thanked her for everything she'd done, and she said I'd made it easy by being organized and reasonable. We said goodbye on the courthouse steps, and I drove to my apartment, windows down, music playing, feeling free. That evening, Victoria came over with a bottle of wine and helped me hang the expensive piece of art I'd bought to celebrate my divorce. It was a painting of a woman standing alone on a cliff overlooking the ocean, and it served no functional purpose except making me happy when I looked at it. We stood back admiring it, and Victoria said it was perfect. I poured us both wine, and we toasted to new beginnings, to being valued, to choosing ourselves. The apartment was small, but it was mine, filled with things I'd chosen because I liked them, not because they made housework easier. Victoria asked what I was going to do next, and I said I was just going to keep living my life, working, making friends, being happy. She clinked her glass against mine and said that sounded exactly right. 2 weeks later, my phone rang while I was unpacking books in my apartment, and Amy's name appeared on the screen. I answered and heard her voice crack as she told me she and her husband were separating. She sounded sad but also lighter somehow, like she'd been holding her breath for years and finally let it out. She said she was moving into her own place next month and figuring out who she was outside of being someone's wife and mother. Then she thanked me for what happened at the anniversary dinner. Said watching me stand up for myself gave her the courage to look at her own marriage honestly. I told her I was proud of her and she could call me anytime. And after we hung up, I sat on my couch surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and felt grateful that something good came from that terrible night. At work the following week, my boss called me into her office and I walked in nervous, wondering what I'd done wrong. Instead, she told me I was promoted to senior marketing strategist with a big raise. She said I'd shown incredible growth and leadership in the months since I started, that my ideas were sharp and my execution was flawless. I thanked her and walked back to my desk in a daze, and that's when it hit me. Leaving Brett didn't just free me from vacuuming and mopping and organizing his pantry. It freed me to become the professional I was always capable of being, the person who had energy left over after work to actually think and create, instead of coming home to a second shift of household management. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I met Victoria and some other friends for dinner at a new restaurant downtown. We were laughing about something when one of the women asked if I was dating yet. I laughed and said I was too busy enjoying my own company and building my career, but maybe someday when I met someone who saw me as a partner instead of a household manager. Everyone nodded and the conversation moved on, and I realized I meant it. I wasn't lonely or bitter. I was just content being myself for the first time in years. On what would have been our 6th anniversary, I sat in my apartment surrounded by art and books and plants I'd chosen because they made me happy. The walls held paintings that served no purpose except beauty. The shelves were full of novels I actually had time to read. My phone buzzed with a text from Brett that just said I'm sorry, and I stared at it for a minute before setting my phone down without responding. I'd already moved forward into a life I was building for myself, and there was nothing left to say to someone who only understood what he'd lost after it was gone.